I never knew true fear. I was not the one to be afraid. I never denied the existence of the supernatural. I was not a skeptic, but I was never really afraid. Mostly because my parents were always away, traveling, exploring, whatever you want to call it, fine. That meant that since I was a teenager, they left me in an empty house, free to do as I wanted. They made a lot of money, so they left me with my own credit card as well. But I was never interested in throwing parties, drinking, or going out to any of the clubs my friends frequented. I would just watch movies, read, and go to school and training. That's also one of the reasons I felt quite safe. I was in judo for 12 years. I knew how to tie my belt before I knew how to tie my shoelaces. So, yeah, I felt like a badass. Well, until 2 nights ago. I got a job at a small cafe, just so I could make some money on my own. The place was okay, except for the fact that its official closing time was at midnight, but the owner and his buddies had made it a habit of staying late and drinking, which meant that both myself and the bartender had to stay until they would stagger out into the night, leaving us behind to clean up the mess. On this particular night, it was about 2 a.m. when we were finally done. It was starting to snow outside. Matt, the bartender, was a pretty cool guy, and we got along fine. He seemed amused by the fact that I was a girl and in judo, and would often ask me to use my training to throw our boss out when he was being a pain in the ass. But unlike me, he was barely making ends meet, so he was kind of stuck in this place. I locked up, only to see Matt slowly dragging himself down the street. "Hey, Matt," I yelled after him. "Need a ride?" I felt bad for the guy. He nodded and walked back to the parking lot. "Thank you so much. It's freezing," he said, a tired smile on his face. We got in the car and he told me where to go. I was familiar with his neighborhood and he didn't live so far away from me, so I dropped him off, said goodnight, and drove off. I was half asleep myself, so I turned up the radio a bit. That didn't help much because a moment later I realized I took a wrong turn. "Shit," I mumbled. It was a one-way street. Never mind, I thought. I'll just drive down the road and probably find the exit next to the main street anyway. Boy, was I wrong. I recognized the senior home by the road before I took a turn, so I knew where I was. But this street was clearly old, and it was in the middle of the heavily wooded area. Run-down houses were barely noticeable between big overgrown trees, and I hit more than one hole driving down the road. That's when my radio changed to static. I tried other stations, but not a single one worked. That's when I started to feel a bit uneasy. Not because of the radio. You know that feeling like someone is staring at you, but when you turn around, there's no one there? Well, that. I looked in the rearview mirror, and of course, the road was empty, except for the fact that now the forest around the road got thicker, and the only thing I could make out was a big building, looking completely abandoned. Where was I? I pulled over and got my phone out to check Google Maps. No bars. I tried to connect to the internet, but nothing seemed to work. It was snowing heavily now. "Screw it," I said, and turned the key in the ignition. It wouldn't start. In fact, not only the engine seemed to be the problem, the entire car was dead. Nothing lit up as I tried again and again. Okay, great. I'm stuck here. Without a phone, all I could do was walk down the damned road and hope that I could flag down a car to the main road. That was wishful thinking at this point, because it was the middle of the night. But I didn't have a choice. Just as I was about to get out, I could swear I saw someone run right past my window. I grabbed the handle and slammed myself up against the door. It was locked. Somehow, this stupid car, completely devoid of any life, managed to lock me in. I tried the passenger's side, but you can guess the result. Then I saw it again, except this time, it ran behind the car. "Hey!" I called out, not exactly sure to whom. Just as I turned my head back to the front, I heard someone whispering. Not like a normal whisper, but one that made my skin crawl. It didn't quite sound, well, human. Another shadow passed by, and I say shadow because it didn't have any actual shape. And then I heard moans. not loud, but painful, tortured moans. I leaned against the window, only to see that there were no footprints in the freshly fallen snow. Then, slowly but surely, they started sliding down from the woods. At first they looked just like shadows, but as they approached me, some of them started taking a human shape. Human-like, to be exact. And now, I was legitimately frightened. They surrounded the car, and I just froze. They were all around me, just whispering and moaning. Tears filled my eyes. I thought, this is how I'm going to die. One of the shadows, in the shape of a little girl, leaned against my window. Her face with a tortured expression, haunting, just standing there. She had no eyes, but the more I looked, the more she seemed human. And when I heard scratching on my window, I looked away and decided I wasn't going down without a fight. So I turned the key once more, and to my immense relief, the car started. I floored it, backing up against one of the trees and somehow managing to turn around in this godforsaken road. By the time I got home, I somehow managed to pull myself together, and in the warmth of my bed, I fell asleep. I got to work a little late the following day, and Matt greeted me with his usual polite smile. Then it faded away. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I wasn't sure what to say. "I didn't sleep well last night. Hey, do you know about that road by the senior home? Where does it go?" "What road?" He seemed confused. "You know, the one in the woods," I said, waiting for him to remember. "There is no road there. It used to be a hospital, but it closed down like 50 years ago, and the only way to get there now is completely blocked by the forest. Why?" Not wanting for my colleague to think I'm crazy, I just brushed it off. "Doesn't matter. Forget it." The day went by fast, and soon I found myself driving home. My windows started to fog for a moment before the heat got to them. And that's when I saw it. In the fog, there was something written. I used to do that all the time when I was a kid, drawing hearts or writing my name. It was barely noticeable at first, but then I saw it clearly. "Help us." "Matt," I heard my coach say. It was a long practice and a hard one. I couldn't get a single throw right that day, and I landed hard on my back a couple of times. I was glad it was over. "What is it with you today? Are you trying to get yourself killed?" asked my coach with a concerned look on his face. I was actually pretty good, so I get it if he was maybe a little annoyed. "Sorry, one of my bad days, I guess." My mind constantly kept going back to that apparently non-existent road. I quickly changed, packed my bag, and went outside. I was not in the mood for a lesson that day, nor could I explain to the man what was going on. So I decided to go check it out. It was broad daylight. What's the worst that could happen? I felt a bit anxious as I drove past the senior home and slowed down a bit, but when I looked for the turn, I couldn't find it. Nothing. There was just a thick line of trees and nothing else. I pulled over and got out of the car, snow squeaking under my shoes. I slowly walked along the forest, trying to see if there was any trail leading through it. That's when I heard a voice. I quickly jumped and turned around, only to see an elderly woman walking carefully towards me. "It's only there at night, you know," she said with a soft, tired voice. Her hair was gray, covered with snowflakes, and her brown coat obviously was too big for her. She seemed so fragile. For a moment, I just looked at her, not responding, so she continued. "You've seen the road, haven't you, dear? And now you've come to find out what happened." Her mind trailed off for a second, her green eyes lined with tears. "They took my girl from me. So long ago. Oh, how I miss her every day." Now she was just a foot away from me, and it was clear she was shaking. She was so small, her face lined with wrinkles. I wanted to ask her so many things, but I didn't even know where to start. "Would you like a cup of tea, dear?" The woman smiled politely, her hand gesturing towards the senior home. I nodded, and we slowly walked down the road. The home was actually really nice. The common room filled with big armchairs, tables, and a beautiful old fireplace. We sat in the 2 chairs by the big window, overlooking the forest. She was silent for a while, so I studied a small cup decorated with flowers in a golden lining. Then she finally spoke. 45 years have passed, and yet I remember it like it was yesterday. She sighed. When Annie was 10, she developed a high fever. It lasted for days, so I had to take her to the hospital. And the doctors and nurses were so nice. They assured me she was going to get well, that once again she would be my happy, healthy little angel. I visited her every day. Her father had to work so he could support us, God rest his soul, but I went every single day. Her doctor would always greet me with a smile, telling me how great she was, how her treatment was going so well, and she seemed better. But one day, when I came into her room, another doctor stood there. He was a big man with a stern look on his face. Oh, I will never forget that face. She paused for a moment, took a sip of her tea, and then continued. Annie didn't smile when I walked in. She seemed pale and scared. Doctor introduced himself as one Dr. Brent and simply said my daughter took a turn for the worse that night. And with that, he just walked out. Didn't even give me a chance to ask what happened. I tried talking to Annie, but she wouldn't say a word. One of the nurses came and told me I had to leave. I told my daughter I loved her and that she would get well. As I was walking out, I saw a tear glide down her face. That was the last time I saw my Annie. Tears filled her eyes once more, but she took a deep breath and placed her hands on her lap. When I tried to go and see her, they would just tell me she had something contagious, that she had to be isolated, and no matter how long I pleaded with them, they never let me go to her again. And that man, that evil man, was always there, with his emotionless eyes, just standing like a wall between me and my girl. The hospital became a dark place, because soon a lot of people were kept there, away from their loved ones, allegedly because of some horrible disease. I still remember the day I came to beg once again, and that's when they told me. They told me my Annie had passed away. Nobody said how she died, and nobody even said they were sorry. Just like that, plain and simple. Dead, they told me. Dead. And just like that, my life was over. Nothing else to live for. My husband took the news even worse. Within a year, he fell ill and just faded away. It was just me and endless, sleepless nights. Pillows only witnesses to my weeps. But then stories began to circulate. Horrible, horrible stories. She shivered. I just sat there, trying very hard not to cry, but she soldiered on. You see, dear, there are some things money can't buy, and one of them is health. Just around the time that alleged disease took our loved ones, one by one, miraculously, some very sick people from wealthier families began to come out of the hospital. Now, I tried long and hard to avoid the rumors, but when my sister came to me one day and told me the story of a woman whose house she cleaned, I couldn't deny it anymore. The woman's husband was very sick for a long time. His kidneys were not working. He was in the hospital during all that time my sister worked in that house, only to return home one day in seemingly perfect health. That was just after almost everybody had died from that incurable illness. His wife seemed so content. She even let my sister go home early that day. But she did not go home. Instead, she came to me. We tried everything to get answers, but to no avail. All I got was an empty casket to bury. After that, we were called lunatics, almost chased out of town. Then the hospital closed. The rumors started to fade, but not the memories of the ones we lost. No, dear, never. I still hear her at night, crying for me to help her. And I tried, darling. Oh, how I tried. Unfortunately, the orderlies here don't let me out at night anymore. Not after I made a mistake of telling them about the woods. They said I had dementia, and they started giving me pills so I could sleep. But I still hear them." She stopped abruptly as one of the nurses passed by. She looked my way and, with a smile plastered on her face, simply told me that visiting hours are over and that I should head home. I looked out the window. It started to get dark, but before I left, the woman extended her hand and gave me a picture. I almost dropped it. It was an old photo of a beautiful girl, long hair falling down her shoulders, her face in a wide smile, her eyes widened with excitement. It was the same girl I saw in my window. The woman spoke one more time. "I'm sorry, dear. I did not introduce myself. My name is Rose, and that is my daughter, Anne. That picture is the last memory I have of her." I handed her the picture back. Hiding tears, I quickly said goodbye and left. I walked back to my car, turned around, and as the last of the lights drained from the sky, I saw the road appear. But this time I didn't take the wrong turn. I knew exactly where I was turning. Truth is, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. My mind was a blur, a mix of anger, sadness, and fear washing over me as I was struggling to go through the forest, only the flashlight from my phone keeping me from tripping over old twisted roots, merely masked by the snow. It almost felt like I was doing it all subconsciously, compelled by some possible outcome of justice. I constantly expected for the shadows to appear. I listened carefully for every sound that I might hear. But there were no shadows, no voices, no ghosts, just creaking of the broken branches and my heavy footsteps making way through the trees. The hospital stood there, looking just as any other abandoned building I've ever seen. I stood still for a moment, catching my breath, and studying the whole setting. Then, a flicker of light appeared in one of the ground floor windows. It was an eerie fluorescent light, and shortly after, it broke through 2 more windows. I quickly turned off the flashlight and took a step back. I was trying to make out if anyone was inside, but nobody came into view. What I did notice, though, now that the light was on, was that the ground floor didn't seem as run down as the rest of the hospital. It almost seemed renovated. But how was that possible? Who else knew about this road? I kept repeating this in my head, while taking very careful steps towards the light, never taking my eyes off of the windows. But nothing changed, except for the occasional flicker of lights. I went around the corner of the building, not wanting to go next to those windows. Whatever turned them on, I'm sure would not be happy to see me staring through one of them. I saw the old emergency exit door, and as slowly as I could, pulled them open. The feeling of dread washed over me as I stepped in the hallway. It was freezing inside, even more so than in the woods. I felt so alone. I understand how silly this may sound, as I chose to come here alone, but it wasn't just that. I felt lonely. I felt abandoned, scared, and vulnerable, like something in here crept its way into me, because the feelings were so intense. I had to push myself to step forward, once again turning on my flashlight, and against every reasonable instinct, against my body almost jerking me back, I started walking. I kept the flashlight pointed towards the door, which consisted of almost disintegrated tiles and the occasional rusted drain. I felt my way around the corridor, and when I saw the first line of light creeping through the door, I placed my phone back in my pocket, once again questioning my sanity. These thoughts faded away as soon as the smell hit me. The smell of rotting, decaying flesh, and something else. Rusting iron, the smell of spilled blood. Covering my mouth and trying hard not to gag, I realized that the floor that was visible from the crack in the door was completely new. Blue tiles, not a single crack in them. That's when I heard a muffled scream, and this one was definitely human. I didn't have time to react, because in the next moment, the door swung open and the light blinded me. Someone grabbed me, and before I could react, threw me full force on the hard, cold floor. I felt a sharp pain in the back of my head, and the lights went out. When I finally opened my eyes, I was still lying on the floor, dazed and utterly frightened. I expected to find myself tied up or chained or whatever else one could possibly imagine would happen in a horror movie. But I was not. I put my hand to the back of my head, where the warm blood tainted my fingers. I tried to get up, but before I got a chance, a male figure appeared, gun in his hand, pointed directly in my face. My jaw dropped. "Matt?" I stuttered, frozen in fear. "Come on your feet," he commanded. I still didn't move. "On your feet, I said!" His voice echoed, bouncing off walls, and his gun waving at me. I somehow managed to get up, shaking and dizzy. That's when I realized we were in something resembling an operating room, and it wasn't just the two of us. On the operating table, there was a girl, her hands and legs strapped firmly to it, her face in utter shock. Her mouth was covered with duct tape, and her muffled begs never stopped. It was her I heard outside the door. "So, do you like it here? I mean, it's quite a setting, isn't it?" asked the bartender, his usual polite smile now replaced with a terrifying grin. He pointed with the gun for me to back up against the wall. He was dressed in scrubs, covered by a blue apron. Little crimson stains scattered throughout it. I still couldn't comprehend what was happening. "Confused, huh? Well, little miss, I'm so brave and smart. It's time for a lesson. You see, I couldn't let my grandfather's work go to waste. Well, that and it pays so good." He stopped and let out a sinister chuckle. "Why don't I show you?" Keeping the gun firmly pointed at me, he gestured towards another door. I had no other choice but to follow him. When he opened them, I nearly fainted. That's where the smell had been coming from. The pile of corpses was almost unrecognizable. Some were only missing limbs, but others, oh my God, the others. They were so disfigured, some stripped completely of their skin, eyes torn out, torsos gaping open with nothing in them. I threw up, not being able to stop myself. Another muffled scream came from the girl on the table. He slammed the door shut, and then calmly continued talking. "Do you know how much people pay me for a kidney? A little kidney? And don't get me started on the eyes." He laughed again, as if he was showing me his baseball card collection. "Stupid people. So gullible, so self-assured. That's how many of them wound up in here anyways." I did just what I had to do. Sometimes, however, if they are smart enough, they believe the rumors and steer clear of this whole thing altogether. That's when I have to lure them in, just like that stupid bitch over there. And just like you. Letting out a giggle of satisfaction, he continued. "A judoka nonetheless, healthy, beautiful, and young. The money I'm gonna get for you alone, that will be a treat. I just have to keep working at that stupid cafe or, people might get suspicious. Poor Matt the bartender, barely making a living. I had to change my name, and lucky for me I wasn't born here, so not a single soul suspected who I was. But I'm wasting time now. People will be coming soon to pick up, well, what's left of you two." He then grabbed a pair of handcuffs and threw them in front of me. "Go ahead. One around that pipe and the other around your hand. We wouldn't want you doing anything stupid like trying to tackle me." I held the handcuffs for a moment, not being able to stop shaking. "Go on. You'll die anyway. Why not make it a little bit easier? I promise, when it's your turn, I'll give you enough anesthetics. You won't feel a thing. Come on, be a good girl, or..." He paused for a moment and pointed to the girl. "I won't give her any. So there you will be, watching her slowly die in the worst pain imaginable." So I did as he asked. There was a little thing he overlooked, though. When I noticed it, my mind suddenly cleared. When he was sure I was in fact tied to the pipe, he put the gun away and approached the girl. He stripped the duct tape off of her mouth, and she begged him. She begged for her life. She cried, she called for help, but her voice was hoarse, almost fading away now. He simply laughed. Like a maniac, he laughed as he pulled a blade, its sharp edges shining in the light, and made a sharp incision across her chest. "You bastard!" I screamed, covering the noise that the rusted pipe made when I ripped the handcuffs from it. Startled, he jumped around, but it was too late. I grabbed the first thing from the instrument board, which happened to be another scalpel, and shoved it into his throat. Shock filled his eyes as he fell to the floor, gurgling and choking in his own blood. I was standing over his body, a bloody scalpel in my hand, tears streaming down my face. The girl was still breathing, although bleeding heavily and unconscious. I grabbed my phone, and when I saw it had one bar, I dialed 911. I'm not quite sure what I said, my tears almost drowning my words. I ran outside, and within minutes there were officers running from everywhere. One of them grabbed me, but I pulled my hand back. "The girl inside! She needs help! Please, go get her!" The EMTs got to me too. They ushered me down the path and in the ambulance. After assuring them I didn't need to go to the hospital, they finally caved, and one of the police officers came to say I have to go with them to give my statement. I had no idea how I was going to explain all of this, but as we walked down the road, I heard one of the officers say, "I could have sworn this road never existed. I must have driven past these woods a million times." His partner just shook his head as we passed my car, still parked by the side of the road. I stopped for a moment. The sun was coming out and the road was still there. But that is not the reason I stopped. On my window, hit by the first rays of the morning sun, was now clearly written, "Thank you."